Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video has to do with what are called the formless attainments in early Buddhism. And it's a strange case, a tension that we find in the early Buddhist Dharma, a tension that is, to an extent, not easily resolvable about whether and how these formless attainments may either lead to or not lead to nirvana. Now, if you don't know what these formless attainments are, I have a couple of videos about them, and I'll leave the videos down below in the notes in case you want to know more. I should say that the idea for this video came from a question by Oliver Bravo from Barcelona. He asked this very question about these formless attainments, the extent to which they can indeed lead to nirvana, and so that's what I'm going to discuss today. First, we'll look at some evidence from the early texts, from particularly early suttas actually, that seem to imply that these formless attainments do not lead to nirvana, that they're not useful, they're not necessary. However, we'll then turn to other suttas in the early texts that seem to imply that they do lead to nirvana, that they can be used profitably, so to speak, they can be used skillfully along the path to enlightenment. And then, after having looked at both options, both the negative and the positive, we'll try to put it all together and sort of look at all the evidence at once. So first, we'll start with a sutta, and suttas in particular, that seem to imply that the formless attainments do not lead to nirvana, that they're not a useful practice along the path. Well, some of us will know that when the Buddha first started out, his first two teachers of meditation, in particular teachers of very, very deep states of calming meditation or samadhi, were Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. And these two teachers taught the formless attainments. They taught the two deepest of the formless attainments, well, leaving aside a fifth one, the cessation of perception and feeling, which we'll get to in a bit, but in any event, they taught two very deep forms of samadhi, of formless attainment. The Buddha to be, Gautama, was said to have studied with both of these teachers and became so proficient at their particular forms of meditation that he was asked by the teachers to then take over for them and teach in their stead, to either teach by himself, teach the community by himself, or to teach alongside the other teacher. And having done so, having gotten to this level with both of these teachers, the Buddha basically describes himself as becoming disillusioned and deciding to leave. What he says is that he left because the teaching they provide doesn't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. It only leads as far as rebirth in the dimension of the thing they were teaching. In the one case, nothingness, in the other case, neither perception nor non-perception. So this seems to settle the matter. It seems that we can take the implication here that these states of formless attainment do not lead to nirvana. Instead, they only lead to either rebirth in the corresponding state, the states of mind that we might be reborn into in the next life, or alternately, we can understand these as simply states of clinging and identification. That's all they lead to. Now, in the suttas that discuss the Buddha's search for enlightenment, it seems that the key point that really made the difference was when the Buddha to be, Gautama, recalled having achieved a state of jhāna when he was a youth, sitting underneath the rose apple tree. It was that realization that there was a state of pleasure that was beneficial, sort of broke him out of his desire, his previous desire, to only be looking for states that were painful in one way or another. He began to realize that pain itself was not the way forward. And as he says, could that be the path to awakening? stemming from that memory came the realization that is the path to awakening. So again, this seems to settle the matter. That jhana, these other states of deep meditative absorption, they are the path to awakening and not the formless attainments. The formless attainments, if we follow these early suttas carefully, we're going to end up believing that the formless attainments are essentially not useful to attain awakening, while jhana is. Now, having seen this first bunch of evidence, let's now turn to several suttas that seem to imply something of an opposite. Not exactly an opposite, they don't oppose the jhanas. However, they seem to imply that the formless attainments themselves can lead to awakening just as much as the jhanas can. Or at least some of them, some of the time. Again, this is something of a question we're going to have to see. So, if we look in fact at one of these early suttas I just mentioned, what's called the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta, in which the Buddha does discuss his early search for enlightenment, in which he discusses the role of jhana, or at least the fact that the formless attainments are not very worthwhile. At the end of that sutta, the Buddha goes on to describe an attainment of nirvana, which leads not only through the jhanas, but also through the formless attainments, and then the cessation of perception and feeling, culminating in nirvana. So it seems that in this very same sutta, he disparages the formless attainments at one point, while including them on a process of the attainment of enlightenment on the other. In particular, he describes the path that a monastic might take to attain nirvana and says, "Furthermore, a mendicant going totally beyond the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception enters and remains in the cessation of perception and feeling. And having seen with wisdom, their defilements come to an end." So what the Buddha here is describing is that you go into each of these states, these attainments, one after the other, and you see them with wisdom, which means that you understand them with insight. You see that they are volitionally produced. You see that they are temporary, that they are going to come to an end, that they are not permanent. You begin to see them this way, and as a result, you become disillusioned with them. Even these very deep states of samadhi, even these states of meditation that are extremely profoundly peaceful, you see as volitionally produced. And it's that route that takes us, that allows these states to be enlightening, so to speak. Now the strange thing here, as I say, is that in this very same sutta, the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta, it begins with the Buddha, or I shouldn't say begins, but in the early part of the sutta, the Buddha essentially disparages these states, while at the end of the sutta, the Buddha includes them as useful in a process of attaining enlightenment. This indicates to me that the sutta may have been created over a period of time, that the early part of the sutta was one that described the Buddha's early experience with these formless attainments, whereas the latter part of the sutta may have been added on afterwards as a kind of a stock passage, understanding that these attainments may also be useful. And we'll get to some of that in the third section of this video, where I discuss this in a little bit more detail. This is hardly the only sutta, however, that gives such a prominent role to the formless attainments in the attainment of nirvana. If this were the only sutta, that would be one thing, but there are many suttas actually that describe how the formless attainments can be useful in this process. Another one is the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness, which discusses a practice of deep states of meditative absorption around this idea of emptiness. And in that sutta, it goes through the formless attainments one by one, and culminates in a somewhat obscure state called Animitta Ceto Samadhi, or the signless concentration of mind, that culminate in enlightenment, in the attainment of nirvana. Now, what exactly this signless concentration of mind, what exactly this deepest state of samadhi in this particular sutta is something of a controversy because it's not well described. It seems to be a state that's related to the state that we've discussed already, neither perception nor non-perception, which is the deepest of these four formless attainments. Because in the state of neither perception nor non-perception, there's sort of no perception going on. It's sort of this intermediate liminal state of mind where nothing can really be perceived. And this signless concentration of mind is called signless because, again, there's no sign. A sign in Buddhism is essentially some aspect of perceived reality to which perception links. In other words, what we see when we see perception are signs, things that we can recognize, if you like. So the signless concentration of mind is a state of mind without any recognizable features. I did an earlier video on this topic of this deep practice of emptiness, and I'll leave a link to that one as well if you want to know more about that. In any event, the sutta goes on to say that it is by seeing these states with wisdom, essentially, that we can attain nirvana. We see the states as volitionally produced, we see them as temporary, and so on. It's that kind of understanding of these states that leads us to the attainment of nirvana. Also, it's I think important to note that in this sutta that I've just been describing, the shorter discourse on emptiness, there's no mention of the attainment of the jhānas. The jhānas don't occur in the sutta at all, which implies that they, at least on this understanding of Buddhist practice, aren't required. That we can simply attain nirvana through the achievement of these formless attainments and this obscure state of the signless concentration of mind. Now, to be fair, the commentary on this sutta claims that jhana is implied. In other words, the commentary says, look, jhana it's never stated that jhana is achieved in this sutta, but that's because it was just left out through an oversight, basically. They needed to be achieved in order to get to the formless attainments. However, that very claim is controversial. That is to say, some meditation teachers, some scholars as well, believe that you didn't need the jhanas in order to achieve the formless attainments, and indeed, you could get to the formless attainments by themselves. And if that's the case, then at least this one sutta does suggest a practice leading to enlightenment without jhana, but with formless attainments. Now, another sutta, called the Man from the City of Attaka, includes a long discussion by Ananda, where Ananda discusses various ways that one can attain enlightenment. And essentially, he says something that resonates with what we've just been discussing, which is that enlightenment can be achieved through essentially any of the deep states of samadhi, including those of the formless attainments, so long as we see them with wisdom. It's the seeing with wisdom that allows any of these states to become enlightening. However, Ananda does leave off the deepest of the four formless attainments. He doesn't discuss it. He doesn't mention it. That is the state of neither perception nor non-perception. So essentially, Ananda says, you can achieve enlightenment through any of these states, but he just doesn't mention the last. Now, there's some question as to why Ananda leaves off this last formless attainment. The commentaries claim that it's left off because it's too subtle an attainment to be seen with wisdom. In other words, to see with wisdom, to see a state with wisdom in the way that we've been discussing, requires us to have perceived something while in the state. However, this deep state of neither perception nor non-perception is a state that is so deep that we're not able to perceive anything while we're in it, and so therefore we can't look back on it with wisdom, and so therefore the implication is that it might not be enlightening. We can't reach enlightenment by attainment of that state. However, there are a number of questions here that remain. First of all, the Chinese recension, the Chinese version of this sutta, does include neither perception nor non-perception. So this is only the Pali one that doesn't. Secondly, we've already seen a couple of suttas that do describe the attainment of nirvana through very, very deep states of samadhi. Indeed, the Arya-Paryesana Sutta ends with the not only neither perception nor non-perception, but the cessation of perception and feeling, which is even deeper, and allows that we can see these with wisdom and thereby attain nirvana. At least that's the implication as I read it. And the one we've just seen, the shorter Discourse on Emptiness, discusses this signless concentration of mind, which presumably is about as deep as neither perception nor non-perception, and talks about how we can achieve nirvana through it. There is another sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya which I think is particularly interesting. It discusses all of the states we've just been mentioning. Well, in any event, it discusses the jhānas, it discusses the formless attainments, and it discusses the cessation of perception and feeling, and talks about how the destruction of the taints, that is to say, nirvana, can be achieved in dependence upon any of them. That's how it begins. However, it then goes on to describe each of these states and essentially ends up by saying that destruction of the taints occurs by seeing these states with wisdom. However, the last two cannot be seen with wisdom. That is to say, neither perception nor non-perception and the cessation of perception and feeling. That is, these last two attainments, as we mentioned before, don't involve perception directly within them. There's nothing being perceived, so therefore they cannot really be used to look back on with wisdom. We don't remember anything about them, we can't see anything while we're in them. And so this sutta goes on to say, and so, mendicants, penetration to enlightenment extends as far as attainments with perception. But the two dimensions that depend on these, the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, and the cessation of perception and feeling, are properly explained by mendicants who are skilled in these attainments and skilled in emerging from them after they've entered them and emerged from them. In other words, taken as a whole, this sutta I've just been describing is kind of strange. It basically begins by saying, yes, we can achieve nirvana based on any of these states. However, you can only describe how this happens with the first bunch. With the last two, you're sort of going to have to rely upon somebody who's done it for themselves and let them describe how it's done. Or perhaps the implication here is there's no description about how it's done in the last two cases. It simply happens. This is something of a question. This sutta is very obscure, very, it raises a lot of issues on its own. But again, the implication here is that the last two of these states, the state of neither perception nor non-perception and cessation of perception and feeling, are so very deep with no perception involved within them that any attempt to attain nirvana or the destruction of the taints and dependence upon them is going to be a process that is so subtle and not describable that, again, you're going to have to rely on somebody who's done them to be able to get anything out of it, that you want to. Now, I have to admit I was sufficiently confused by all of this stuff that I've been raising here in this video that I brought it up with Bhikkhu Bodhi, who was an eminent translator and scholar of the early material. And to be fair, he was equally not sure about exactly what to make of all this, at least as I understand his response to me, which was in an email. What he did, however, was to refer to one, what we might term an infamous sutta, which is a sutta where Sāriputta describes his own experience or at least his experience, the experience of Sāriputta is described to us by the Buddha, as I recall, and in which Sāriputta describes his experience in each of these states of deep meditation. Now, some of us will know Sāriputta was the Buddha's closest disciple, his right-hand disciple, the disciple who was considered first in wisdom. So he's somebody with a particularly acute and lucid mind. And so the Sāriputta goes through each of these states and describes it, or at least the Buddha describes how Sāriputta saw each thing in them, in this state. However, when it comes to the last state, the cessation, I should say, the state of neither perception nor non-perception, at this point, the sutta says this: he emerged from that attainment with mindfulness. Then he contemplated the phenomena in that attainment that had passed, ceased, and perished. Now, we can see here this description of the neither perception nor non-perception is essentially free of any descriptive components. It simply says that he was aware of the stuff that had passed. However, there's no description of what actually had passed in that state, which distinguishes it from the prior states, which did have some perceptual components in them. What this shows is that Sāriputta, at least in this particular sutta, who is supposedly the sort of the deepest meditator, who's able to see the most, or at least him and the Buddha are able to see the most, that's all he could get out of it. And then further, the sutta goes on to say, furthermore, going totally beyond the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, he entered and remained in the cessation of perception and feeling. And having seen with wisdom, his defilements came to an end. So he became enlightened based upon this, the seeing with wisdom that occurred after his exit from the cessation of perception and feeling, or at least that's the implication here. Now, there are a couple of odd features of this implication. The first one is, this does imply that there is enough in the cessation of perception and feeling to be seen with wisdom. Before we were claiming, based on other suttas, that you really couldn't see such things with wisdom because there wasn't enough to see there. Here, the implication is that there is enough to see. The second implication here is that this is how Sāriputta himself became enlightened. That is to say that Sāriputta became enlightened through a process of going through these deep states of samadhi, going through these states of formless attainments, and finally through the cessation of perception and feeling, and then reaching enlightenment that way. However, this isn't how Sāriputta attained enlightenment. Indeed, I did an earlier video on Sāriputta, which I can leave also down below in the notes, where I described Sāriputta's attainment of enlightenment. Indeed, Sāriputta attained enlightenment after having listened to a short discourse by the Buddha. The Buddha was discussing some matter with another person, another man. Sāriputta was there fanning the Buddha and hearing what the Buddha had to say, and hearing a certain thing from the Buddha, Sāriputta was enlightened. That's at least how it's described. In this sutta, however, that description is somewhat different. Further, and this is why I said that this sutta is somewhat infamous, this sutta where Sāriputta describes all of his attainments, or they're described for him, his attainments of these various states, this does not occur in any other recension. This sutta is exclusive to the Pali Canon. Also, this sutta appears to be late in the sense that a number of scholars believe that it includes information and a presentation that is very close to the presentation we find in the Abhidharma, which is a later phenomenon in Buddhism that occurred maybe a couple of centuries after the Buddha's lifetime, a century or two, let's say. So, taken all together, that would imply that this sutta probably is not one that we can really be very confident about. It's probably late, it's probably exclusive of the Pali tradition, which means that it may be sectarian, it may have been constructed after the split of the schools. And as we've just seen, it describes an enlightenment process for Sāriputta that doesn't seem to actually mimic the one that we know he actually went through, or at least that we have better evidence for. So having been through this evidence, the third part of this video is going to be what we want to make of it. What is the upshot here? Well, first of all, it's pretty clear from the early suttas, insofar as we have access to them, that we indeed can attain nirvana, we can attain enlightenment through the formless attainments. This contradicts some of these early claims that these formless attainments were basically completely useless. They aren't completely useless, they indeed can be made use of. However, secondly, there is some controversy, some disagreement within the suttas themselves about precisely how that is to be done, and precisely which of the formless attainments can be useful in this regard. Again, some suttas seem to say that any of the formless attainments, including the deep state of cessation of perception and feeling, can lead us to enlightenment, whereas other suttas seem to imply that the latter two, being neither perception nor non-perception or cessation of perception and feeling, really can't lead us to enlightenment because there's not enough there to see with wisdom, and we need to be able to see them with wisdom in order for them to be enlightening. And as we've seen in one sutta, which I think is quite interesting, it does allow that we can achieve enlightenment through any of these states I've just been mentioning, but the latter two, that attainment is just sort of obscure and not really easily describable, and so you're going to have to go to somebody who's done it in order to figure out how and why and all the rest. So what do I make of all this? Well, what I make of this is that probably when, or perhaps, this is at least speculation on my part, that when the Buddha started out, he began his description of enlightenment based strictly and directly on how he himself had achieved it. He himself did not achieve it through these states of formless attainment. He had left those behind. He achieved enlightenment through the jhānas, which are different states of meditative absorption. Not quite as deep as the formless attainments, different. So he began that way. He began teaching that way. And so many of the suttas that we have in the canon basically describe an attainment of enlightenment through the jhānas, again, mirroring the Buddha's own experience. However, as time went on, and again, the Buddha taught for many, many decades, as time went on, probably what happened is that other monastics were able to attain enlightenment through other methods. In particular, some perhaps were able to attain enlightenment through the formless attainments, through the cessation of perception and feeling. They would come to the Buddha and describe this, or to other monastics and describe this, and people began to realize that there were other paths to enlightenment that involved more states. And so, over time, suttas as they were produced, either by the Buddha himself as the Buddha gave talks based on this new information, or perhaps after the Buddha's lifetime, other monastics would have created these suttas in his name, said, look, here are different methods of attaining enlightenment. You can do it through the jhanas, you can do it through the formless attainments, or whatever. This still does leave up in the air the question about the deepest ones, why it is that some suttas seem to say you cannot use them, and other suttas seem to say you can. My assumption once again here, is that probably this melding of these different traditions within early Buddhism was at an unresolved state, either when the Buddha died or when the canon became somewhat closed. And so what we remain with is a canon that includes some suttas that seem, again, to imply that these deeper states are not useful, and other ones that seem to, or that directly do imply that they are useful. So what we end up with is something of an unresolvable quandary here, where we're not really able to say very much, except that there were clear disagreements, or apparent disagreements at least, in the early tradition. But if we take them all together, I think we can say that any of these states of deep samadhi can be enlightening if we're able to see them with the proper wisdom. Now, there are indeed other issues in the early Sangha that were similarly, or seem at least to have been similarly controversial, where there are questions that came up that were not easily resolved, and even the commentaries seem to have had trouble with them. And I'll leave a video up here on the screen about one such topic that is controversial to this day. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much to all of you, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.